first panel today, we are lucky enough to have really two esteemed guests who are well known in the transit world in New York City. First person we'll hear from is Robert Paaswell. Robert Paswell is a distinguished professor of civil engineering at City College and the former director of the University Transportation Research Center. Next, we will hear from Bettina Sanchez. Bettina Sanchez is currently the director of the New York Regional Planning Association. Is also a visiting professor, assistant professor at the Pratt Institute, where she teaches on issues of neighborhood change. We are extremely lucky to have both of them. Following their remarks, there will be a chance for all of you to weigh in with your comments and questions, so write them down and save them till then. In terms of framing the discussion, which was part of what I was asked to do, it struck me as a researcher whose interests are in transit, but whose focus is largely outside of the New York City area. One of the questions we might ask is where the New York City transit crisis fits within the broader context, sort of the broader national debate on urban mass transit and generally. Of course, as soon as one steps back to take this broader view, one is immediately struck by how unique New York City is and how, more specifically, how unique the New York City subway system is. Just to give you some sense of what I mean, the New York subway, and this is apart from surface bus transit or Metro North, carries more than 2.5 times the number of riders per year than the other 9 metro systems in the country. It's just an extremely productive, extremely busy system. The New York City carries 10 times more people than the Washington, D.C. Metro. It carries 11 times more people than the Chicago L. In 2015, it was reported that the New York City subway accounted for 26% of the nation's total unlinked passenger trips. That is, 1 out of every 4 trips taken on public transit in this country was taken on the New York City subway, which is kind of an amazing thing. This also extends to questions of growth and where we've seen growth. In 2014, the American Public Transportation Association reported, I don't know if you remember this, rather triumphantly, that national transit ridership had exceeded its previous record from 1957. But to dig in the data, what you saw was that the vast majority of the growth between 2005 and 2014 came from growing subway ridership. It's a New York City story once again. So what does it mean, or what does that all mean? Well, it means, at least in some sense, the idea of placing the New York City transit crisis within a broader national frame is a tough slog. It's just, it's a kind of unique place. So the crisis facing New York transit, has been born in some degree out of the success of transit and the really unprecedented success that we've seen here. Think about transit in Tampa, Florida, for example, which was recently reported as one of the worst transit places to be transit dependent in the country. The problems of transit they face there are different in scope and scale than they are here. So of course, stepping back once again to yet another level of abstraction. One way of understanding where the New York City crisis does fit in within the national context is by pointing out, I think, something that is probably obvious to all of us but deserves mentioning, which is I think it's impossible to see a crisis in transit without thinking about crises in other sectors. That is, it's impossible to understand the transit crisis without understanding crises in other areas of public and social life. That is, you can't think about the transit crisis without thinking about the looming environmental crisis, the crisis of the public sector. It's hard to think about the transit crises without thinking about crises in the Highway Trust Fund, although that debate is no longer 2015, but it's sure to come up again. It's hard to think about the transit crisis without thinking about broader crises in infrastructure and infrastructure spending. There is looming With respect to the crises in the public sector, there's obviously questions of Veolia, large private corporations that provide transit service, and Uber encroaching on transit turf, although that's debatable. And there's also, I think, Purina might note that there's obvious relations between transit crises in housing, affordable housing, where people live, and all that. To take an even wilder stab, and this connects maybe to what we do here at the Murphy Institute, it's hard to think about the crises in transit without crises of work, as there's now debates over automation, self-driving cars, and what that will mean for the future of transit in cities. So, in the spirit of crises, linking New York City to all these broad crises, I'd like to quickly turn it over to Robert Paaswell, who can bring us to sort of some of our more immediate concerns.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you, and thank you to the Murphy Institute for asking me to come and talk about something that I've liked to talk about for the last 40 years or so, and still haven't solved the problems, but that keeps us employed, so that's as researchers, so that's probably part of why we're still doing it. When I was asked to talk about the crisis, they put on the fact that what are we going to do about the MTA? And it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and you know, having done work with the MTA, having worked with the Chicago Transit Authority, having worked with transit properties literally around the world, and looking at how Europe has solved or attempted to solve some of its problems, we find that there are many dimensions in addressing how can we improve the mobility of people in cities. Well, today I'll talk mostly about New York City Transit. We know that the other branches of the MTA also are facing modernization issues and new issues, but most of what we call the noise from the audience, or you know, the article in the Times today, or the articles in the Post, the news every day about delays on trains and everything, are about New York City Transit, and we'll focus on that. But we're facing a mobility crisis, and the easiest way I like to say that, and I don't want to insult anybody, but if you've moved into the Upper West Side in the last 10 years, you're part of the problem. You've crowded my 72nd Street subway station. It wasn't crowded when I moved in there 27 years ago. It is now, and basically, it's a question of how can we improve mobility? People want to get from home to work. They'd like to live close to work. And we know that there are a lot of forces in New York that are changing that around. So the problem is a congestion problem. And it's a congestion problem 24 hours a day. And the dimension isn't just that the MTA needs work, because we know the MTA needs work. It needs to be improved. It needs to be more reliable. And we know that there are programs now to increase that. But the symptoms that we get from this congestion are that people come to work angry, unproductive. We want to get to our activities faster. People moved along the L line, and now the L line is crowded, and people complain they can't get in fast enough. And we have simple solutions. We say, well, if we have the next generation fare payment, which are mobile ticketing on our phones, and we fix a few signals, we'll be in great shape. But that really isn't the only answer. We have to look at some of the factors. The first thing, if we talk about the transportation aspect, part of the problem is the infrastructure is old. And the infrastructure is primarily 20th century designed infrastructure, designed for the way people moved in the 20th century, which is changing very rapidly in this middle part of the 21st century. We think of the fact that the MTA and the New York City rail lines opened in the early 1900s. And from the same time the railroad, Penn Station was built, they're operating on old tracks, old switches. Sure, they've been replaced and everything, but the fundamental designs are designs to move people and the subways from the outer boroughs into central Manhattan. And the irony, of course, is because it's so desirable, because the accessibility is so great, Manhattan continues to grow at leaps and bounds. And I looked up some data just to see, am I getting more neighbors? And in the first quarter of 2015, there were 17,000 new apartment applications, new apartment opening in Manhattan. And if you take 17,000, you multiply it by 1.25 people per apartment, that's 22,000 people. And if half of them use a subway, that's 10,000 people. 10 more trains we need. We don't have them, the trains get more crowded. So we have what I call sustained but unbalanced urban growth. It isn't that we've got the 5 boroughs and distribute the jobs and the housing uniformly among the boroughs to make it easier to get around. We concentrate to where we've built already, and we create demand to get to where we've built already. And it's built around a system that once provided great accessibility, but it's becoming more and more difficult. As the trains get crowded, they become delayed just from the crowds alone, and they're dealing with old infrastructure. We also know there's work housing disparities that depending on your job, if you're high income and you travel to the financial part of New York, you can get down, you can own an apartment in the central of Manhattan, but you can't if you're lower income. So people are the lower the income, the more you're pushed to the peripheries of the 5 boroughs and into New Jersey and other states that I forgot the names of. And what that means is your commutes become longer, and as they become longer and as the trains become more crowded, you're subject to more delays, more anger, and it's blamed basically on the MTA. But there is a land use part of this that you have to absorb. It's part of how we structured our city, and it's part of the geography. And we have congestion, and incorporated in the congestion, and especially in Manhattan, is the fact that we've got more trucks coming in, more people want things delivered. There's nothing like seeing the food delivery service, big truck parked on your corner and the guy's coming with the boxes up to your apartment, probably double parked, cars going around them, and it's part of congestion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on buses, but the simple thing with buses is bus needs exclusive bus lanes, and they need bus stops. And without that, bus time is going to be slow, and buses become unreliable, and people then jump to the nearest mode, especially the younger people who know only things on their smartphone, and they go to Uber or Lyft and take away from that. I'll talk about that in a little while. So our infrastructure, urban infrastructure is fixed. The geography is there. New York Manhattan is an island. We've got bridges, we've got tunnels, and we're limited to what we have, but we don't plan our growth around what we have the way they are in a lot of the other cities that were mentioned before. We don't plan our growth around that, and we're not rethinking our transportation systems around perhaps a better solution to the distribution of people and jobs. Okay. And this is just a slide to show that Manhattan imports workers. What it means is there are more people who work in Manhattan than there are workers in Manhattan. So we have this tremendous flow in, and it's a huge number. This is just a sense of the scale of the transportation system, and it reaches out 75 to 100 miles from the city in terms of commuting shed. The first job, when we talk about the MTA, the first job of any transit chief is to make service. Transit chief knows that in New York, I've got 8 million trips a day, and I have to make sure that I can carry 8 million trips a day. I don't want to have buses and rail cars to carry 6 million or 5.5 million. I have to do that. So there's incredible pressure, all of you who want to use transit, there's incredible pressure to see your train in the station when you get there, or see your bus at the bus stop close to when you get there. And without that, we wouldn't be able to get around in New York. So the overriding mantra at MTA is let's make service, and let's do everything we can to make service. And we're doing it in an increasingly crowded system, a system that needs more repairs, and a system that needs to be updated. They mentioned some numbers before. The MTA is big. The operating budget is over $14 billion. The proposed capital budget is $30 billion over 5 years. And it's carrying over 8 million people a day through nearly 500 stations and 6,500 cars, 4,400 buses, et cetera, et cetera. All this is part of what the budget is about. It's part of the fact that you have to maintain your system, you have to pay for your system, you have to upgrade it, and now we're at the point where we have to modernize the system, go from mechanical to digital and digital control. And if you think about just changing the fare box on 4,400 buses or changing the token machines at 468 subway stations, you can imagine what the tremendous cost and the tremendous amount of time would do to take that. But we're also undergoing tremendous growth. The MTA is growing in ridership. We know that there's peak ridership now, and we feel that it's going to grow, but it might begin to stabilize. Bus ridership is down a little because the buses are going slower on the more crowded streets. New York City population is growing, not just in my neighborhood, but over the whole 5 boroughs. And these people want to move around from job to work, or from home to work, or from home to social activities, home to shop, other things, and they need transportation to do that. And the growth is uneven. The largest growth is projected to be in Brooklyn, and the smallest in Staten Island. So there's no sense of distributing it. Exacerbating the growth is the fact that there's increasing numbers of trucks and truck deliveries, and that's influenced by the internet, and that's clogging the streets more. And there's an increase in the for-hire vehicle competitors, including Uber, Via, and others. And I just want to clarify something. Uber and Via, they're not shared rides. You're not sharing the ride with the driver. You're buying services. And you're buying services often from drivers who are exploited by this is a union place, so I can say that, and they understand what I mean, who are exploited by their owners. We know that for Uber in general. We're rethinking the streets for safe streets. So all of a sudden we're changing the street designs. We want bicycle lanes because that's an alternative mode. And so the streets are changing, the competitors are changing. In an article I just read yesterday, by the University of California, looked at the impact of these new for-hire companies, these new computer-driven for-hire companies. It showed that, one, they add to traffic. They looked at the 10 largest cities in the United States. They add to traffic in the 10 largest cities, and they detract from transit service. And the other thing we know about them is that the cohort that uses them most are the under 40 people who are using that, people who grew up on their cell phones. So we have to address the fact that we have a changing culture that's changing how we use our city, how we use our streets, and how we deal with it. Increasing number of tourists and decreasing bus speeds on non-select service routes, and even on select service routes. We often, if you've been on a bus, you'll know, and you watch, all of a sudden a truck will pull in front of the bus, or there'll be a truck parked in the no parking zone, or taxis will pull in front. We need to make sure that we sustain exclusive bus lanes. So we have this problem of the streets, and then this problem with the dispersion of the population and where they live and where they work. So what does the MTA need? Well, it needs money, certainly, and we know that. I'm not going to read that in the newspapers. Why do they need all this money? How are they spending it? It needs the money because anybody that produces 8 million of anything a day needs money. That's just common sense. And it needs to revitalize its capital. It needs money from capital. And it needs money to sustain an operating program that has to change from a mechanical operating program to digitally controlled. And all of that takes money. And it takes will to get that done. So modernization is a priority. It has to be done. It needs system integration. We need to think more than just the different subway lines and the bus lines and New Jersey Transit and PATH. We have to think regionally about integrating the system to make the system meet more of the riders' needs. We need bus route rationalization. We have to rethink where our buses are going and rethink whether we need all the same size buses, the way they're doing in LA. And we need to do all of this much more quickly than we're doing it. We know that the MTA has two budgets, and we know that they're both subsidized, and the subsidies come from different places, and that the MTA, unlike other transit properties, unlike California where they passed a tax issue, and in LA where they're building rapidly, they know for the next 5 years how much capital they're going to have and how they can spend it. Here we know every year we have to sort of go hat in hand to Albany and see, can we get more subsidy? Can we go to the feds and get more budget? So the problem with the MTA is there's no long-term secure source of funding. And to a transit person, that's probably one of the most critical things. You want a long-term source of funding. You know, if you don't have that, if you have to go into the market to buy rail cars, for example. We faced this at Chicago. We wanted to buy rail cars for 5 years, but we couldn't promise any vendor that we'd be able to pay them after 3 or 4 years. And so the vendors put in the cost of risk into their bids, and you're paying a higher price per rail car because you're paying for the risk of not having certain money. And the MTA certainly needs long-term sources of funding, and we're not sure where that's going to come from. So the real issue is, who owns the MTA? Who are the stakeholders? The biggest stakeholders are the riders. New York City is a stakeholder. The state is a stakeholder. The MTA is a public corporation. And the stakeholders are people who work in the city and come from other states. And the stakeholders, to me, one of the largest groups are the developers and the businesses and the hospitals. Those people who rely on a labor force, or for a developer, the people living in their apartments to get to those places because you have a good transit system. And we'll talk later, but I don't think they're paying their fair share of the value of the public investment. The public invests in transit, and the other stakeholders take advantage of it, but don't share in any of the costs. The MTA, as we know, is a public authority under New York state law, but this argument that's going on now, mayor, governor, mayor, you've got to throw that aside. New York City gets the biggest economic value from the value of the transit. And so, in my feeling, New York City, and however it's done, has some obligation to share in the cost for this tremendous economic value that's created. And we can talk about that more in Q&A. I've only got a few more minutes. And the funding for the MTA does not reflect the economic value that it brings. The funding for the MTA comes from the old model. Let's pay out of the fares for some of the operating costs and go beg for the subsidy for the rest. For capital, let's go to Washington and see what we get, and then bond the rest and pay the debt service out of the fare box. So you'll find that out of the fare box, 20% or 25% of the fare is going to pay debt service. That's 20 to 25% more operating service you could have if the debt service were assumed by the state or the city. So what has to be done? As I mentioned, for the MTA, we have to modernize, we need improved communications, we have to rationalize it with other emerging commuter modes, which are these app-driven modes and other transit systems. We need to modernize the organizational structure of not just the MTA, and I'll say a word about that in a second. And we need new labor agreements. And this is not saying, this is not hostile to labor, but we've got a lot of the labor agreements include past practices, a lot of which are probably not followed anymore. You don't need anymore. So I think you can save money and get new labor agreements that deal with the fact that our workers are working under a more modern, more high-tech environment, and how do we train workers, labor workers, union workers, how do we train them and give them more skilled jobs? So modernization, 2 minutes now? Okay. Modernization, we see a lot of modernization here, but we don't have smart infrastructure, and that's the biggest cost. Putting kiosks in the stations are great. Countdown clocks where you have them are great. The apps on your thing which tell you when the next bus is coming is approximately correct, but you really need to think about it. Think about what GPS does. Think about your car. You need to have instrumentation in every station on every vehicle and central control to know where things are to actually begin to control your system. And so in that sense, we have to convert from a post-World War II system to a 21st century. Again, I talked about for hire vehicle competitors, we have to address the fact that this is real, this is large, this is taking a lot of the riders away. Is there a way of integrating them into the public transit system? Modernization and its impact, we know that there's bicycles. So you look at streets, and a lot of the streets are taken up by Jay Walter's bicycles. That's a picture of a mobile app where you can pay for your ticket on your phone. And I understand the MTA is already trying that out at 1 or 2 stations. And this, to me, is the biggest example of modernization. You get on any subway car, and that's what you see, is that people don't know where they are or what they're doing, but they do know they're playing that game with the fruits and vegetables or whatever that is. So what's next? The most important thing is we have to organize for mobility and not for modes, because we're dealing with land use, we're dealing with people's choices, we're dealing with the fact that the choices are more than ever. And what's the best example of that? In my mind, London has the best example, or Shanghai, where you have a centralized organization that combines transit, combines the streets, combines truck deliveries, goods deliveries, and other factors, fare setting, levels of service, when you can use the streets, when trucks can park, when cars can park, when construction is done. And we have to rethink, we have to start the problem of saying, if we want to improve congestion in New York, if we want to improve people's mobility, what will the city look like? What will we be doing after that occurs? Not saying, this is what we have now, and let's turn the knob on each, because I think if we just do that, we're not going to, 5 years from now, I'm not going to be here 5 years from now giving this speech, but maybe some of you will be the thing. It's not transit alone. Transit and land use are inseparable. So we also need new funding models, and it has to include the city, but it has to include those who are beneficiaries of the system, the beneficiaries and polluters, and people who add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We have to find a way to have them share in the costs of the system that's there. And in the end, I say we're all New Yorkers and we can do it. Thank you.
Good morning. How is everybody? I like this podium. Usually when I stand by a podium, I'm like, so I'm really happy for this. So first of all, I just have to say, this is not fair that I have to go after Buzz because Buzz is mentor to one of my mentors. And so if you hear some similarities and themes, that's really where some of that is coming from. So by way of introduction, my name is Bettina Sanchez, and I'm the New York Director at Regional Plan Association. So I work with all of our teams on community and housing issues, environmental issues, and our transportation issues. And I work in 3 areas doing research, but also local plans and advocacy. So for those of you who might not be familiar with RPA, which I suspect is maybe 0.2% of you, we are a regional organization. We work across 3 states. That's 31 counties, 782 municipalities. That is a typo. And that's about 23 million residents. We work by doing long-range regional planning since the early 1920s, so we're about 100 years old. And today we're working on the 4th regional plan. And so everything that I'm going to say today is informing our 4th regional plan, which is due to be released on November 30th of this year. Mark your calendars, follow along, be there. It's really exciting for us. We've been working on this project for a very long time. So what is the 4th regional plan? What are we looking at and why? Well, a couple of years ago when we started to think that we needed to come back together, right? We do this once a generation. So when we started talking and having discussions about coming back to get together to think about the 4th regional plan, what really informed it was the rapid rate of change. Rate of change both with respect to technology, but also what is happening with our climate and the inequality that is increasing in our communities across the region. And so those are the three drivers and the 3 areas that we work on that are informing our work. And broadly speaking, to give you the problem statement, what we're working on is, first of all, that our coastlines are changing around us. And so the environment that we are living in, that we know today, our borders, right, are going to be dramatically different in just 30 to 50 to 70 years. Second is that we have a crisis of affordability and inequality. It is growing. And so the affordability crisis that we hear so much about through fears about gentrification and displacement here in the city are actually echoed throughout many parts of our region in frighteningly similar ways. And third is that we have a transit crisis, which is what we're here to talk about. And this is a really critical piece of what the fourth plan aims to tackle, because our transit network, as Buzz has put better than I can, it's really our veins, right? We are the blood, and then our veins are the transit network that allow us to travel through, connect with each other, access opportunities. When I was in high school, I attended, SAT classes in Queens, even though I lived in the Bronx. Couldn't do that in any other place. And actually, I should say that as bad as our transit crisis is in the city, we are actually very fortunate to still be the #1 city in the world, by many accounts that is, in terms of how connected we are to each other. So the good, the bad, and then a couple of other points that I will make. The good is that we are growing, or bad, depending on if your neighborhood is overcrowded. Buzz, I do not live in the Upper East Side, not my fault, but I feel you. Train is crowded when I get on in the morning on Fordham Road in the Bronx. So I can only imagine what happens. Well, I'm sitting down, and I know that you guys can't get a seat by the time we get to the 80s. But we are growing. New York City alone added 611,000 jobs just in the last 5 years, between 2010 and 2016. That's a 16% growth rate, much higher than other places in the country. Tourism is higher than ever. Our population growth is, as I said, is higher than ever before. And at RPA, as we think about the future and what our vision should be, we actually think that that rate can continue. And it can be positive if, and only if, we take the right steps to accommodate that growth. But the bad, we've heard from this, and so I'm just going to mention a couple of numbers, and specifically relating to New York City Transit. First, travel speeds. Well, actually, this is just with relation to streets. Travel speeds have decreased by 20% in Manhattan, south of 60th Street, just between 2010 and 2016. Over 700,000 delays are experienced on our subways per month. Our bus ridership is declining, so 46 million bus ride decrease between 2010 and 2015. And if you actually start to quantify that, never mind the health effects, right? The stress and the agita that you have to go through when you're delayed on these trains. But it's also, there's an economic cost, and that is around $390 million per year. And that was an older estimate. Maybe this is too much in my height. So what's going on? Well, first of all, as has been mentioned, we're not building enough. We're not investing enough in our transportation network. And so just between our transit network, our subway system is 112 years old. And since the 1930s, we've added only about 6 miles of track. That is 1% of the length of our subway system. 4.5 stations have been added. That's 1% of our stations. And our subway cars, as Buzz mentioned, we're not keeping up with state of good repair. So many of our subway cars are actually old enough to vote. They're 19. And some of them are almost old enough to drink. Right? And so we have to really revisit how we are investing and the timeliness with which we are investing in our infrastructure. So why don't we invest? Well, the reasons are myriad. But for one, it costs so much, and it takes so long to do anything related to transit improvements on our rail in New York City that it's really a barrier. So first, it costs 4 times as much to build 1 mile of subway here in New York City as it does in Paris or Tokyo. So we're not talking about other places that have cheaper land, by great extents or anything like that. We're talking about competitive international cities who are doing this for much less and much faster. And second, just for an example, the East Side Access Project initially we thought that we were going to complete it by 2013, and it's now going to be completed in 2022. That's a delay of almost a decade. And get this, every year that a transit project, a subway improvement project is delayed in that way, we're talking about $1 billion of extra costs. So how do we think about the solutions? And this is where, for me, it's such an interesting time to be at RPA, and I've been at RPA for several years working on the plan. We are thinking about this crisis not just with with respect to the specific issues that are plaguing the MTA, that are plaguing our streets, the inefficiencies with which we control our streets. We're also thinking about the broader picture. What are our goals for the region? First, we want to be healthier. We have been getting healthier, but we have a ways to go, especially because of the disparities that we have along race and class lines. Second, related to that, is equity, bringing different groups of people up as we improve our systems. Third, sustainability. Our climate is changing. We need to emit less, and we need to live more seamlessly with our nature. And fourth, of course, we need money to do all of this, right? We want to see continued growth, and so that is also one of our major goals. And so in thinking about the transit crisis in this way, we start to emphasize different things. And so in the 4th Regional Plan, one of the reports we put out last year as a problem statement was called the State of the Region's Health. And what that really is looking at is how do the elements of the built environment contribute to the health of the people in our region? So about 85% of any one person's health is actually determined more by their zip code, place-based characteristics, than anything else, lifestyle choices, etc. Sorry, that's the wrong direction. But there are positives here, right, in thinking about this health lens that actually make the imperative for investment even higher. So our region and our core, New York City, Newark, Essex County, even parts of Westchester County in the lower parts, we have a built-in gym. I bought a fancy watch that tracks my my activity every day, and I forgot it today, darn. But you know, when I get home every day, I'm really shocked at how many calories I burn. I'm like, I just sat at my desk the entire day. I typed and I researched and I did all these things. But in fact, no, I ran up those stairs because I was delayed on the subway, and so I had to run back into that meeting. And then I walked to get lunch, and I walked to here, and I walked there. And it adds up, and it makes us a healthier region. And second, because of our dense street network here in the core in New York City, we're actually, per capita basis, we're pretty good on traffic fatalities. We have a long way to go. Any death is too many, as our Vision Zero goal in the city illustrates, but we are still very, very much healthier than other parts of the region. And then next, another part of the important framing for the 4th plan, and a lot of my work has been on how do you do inclusive planning, and how can inclusive planning actually change the way that you look at the problem statements and the way that you think about solutions. And so I have been working with colleagues at RPA in partnership with a lot of base-building organizations to reach underrepresented communities that are usually left out of planning processes. So partnering with organizations like Make the Road New York Communities for Change, Community Voices Heard in New York City. And working with them has actually changed the way, again, that we have thought about the planning process. So in March of this year, I worked with colleagues at RPA to release a report called Pushed Out. And Pushed Out, the premise behind Pushed Out is thinking about the affordability crisis in housing, but it's actually so interconnected with our transportation network. Actually, the places in this region where people are most vulnerable to residential displacement because of their economic characteristics are the places that are really cool to live in, because we can access transit, we can get to work without owning a car, we live healthier lives, and so these places are increasingly more attractive. But as Buzz said, that means that there is this connection between the availability of our transit and the quality of our transit, and then who can actually stay and benefit. So how do we then start to think about solutions? Well, first of all of these goals that I just mentioned have us orient in a slightly different way, possibly. So on the left, you have a chart that's showing how street space, for example, is presently allocated in New York City. So you'll notice that most of our street space goes to moving vehicles, and then a quarter goes to parked vehicles, so more than 75% just there on cars and vehicles on the road. And then when you think about the human beings on there, then we only have 23% of our space is sidewalks, and less than 1% today is dedicated to biking. And so if we flip the way that we prioritize our street space, right, we can actually get so much more bang for our buck in terms of mobility. If we had really well-functioning bus service that wasn't so slow, imagine how many people would transfer over from the subways, and that would actually cause less crowding without a cent of investment in the subway. Not that we don't need investment in the subway, I'm getting there. But in the fourth plan, we're really trying to push this paradigm of we need to prioritize pedestrians and walking and biking much more because of the health benefits, because of the equity benefits, but also because this is a more efficient way to manage our congestion. Next up is our goods movement and our on-street transit. And then for hire vehicles that hopefully you're sharing with someone and not just purchasing for yourself. And finally is the private automobile. So in thinking about solutions, I tried to make this as vague as possible so as not to give away the cake for November 30th. But many of these have already been mentioned, again, because there is that relationship between who my mentor is and who's leading transit at RPA and the great work that Buzz has done for decades. So first, we're going to emphasize the importance of revisiting how our transit agencies are governed. So does it make sense to separate finance and operations, who does what and how, and should we separate our systems in the way we do? And now I'm expanding to talk about commuter rail and New York City Transit, subway and bus, as well as our airports and all the different agencies that have different roles in that. Modernizing our subways is critical. 13% of our subway delays are due to signal issues, and so there are many interventions that can be adopted if we have the right governance structures to get them across. We should transform our street use, improve commuter options across the Hudson. So, the frame to thinking about this fourth bullet, fourth bullet, is that the more that you the shorter you make commute times, the smaller the region becomes, right? So you can live in Westchester, and I don't know why you would do this, but you could work in Jamaica, Queens, if you had an efficient connection, right? And that makes the world of opportunities a lot larger to you. So finally, we're also talking about airports, and just a couple of days ago on the 9th, we released our report on autonomous vehicles. So thinking about how cities can have control, and cities and states can be a part of the conversation as the technology evolves to be able to do these things, like control our streets and prioritize them the way that we want to, control congestion, but also be welcoming of the technology that has so much potential for good, if done in good ways. So perhaps more surprising on this list are other recommendations that are related specifically to promoting health and reducing inequality. So what about if we, in our transit planning, included health impact assessments and how we quantify the benefits of a coming transit project? What if our transit agencies had chief health officers? And then finally, thinking about walkability as a goal to promote, this jungle gym of a region's core that we have, and being more participatory and more inclusive in the way that we plan. Actually, the final point that I will make is that if we do this right, if we dig ourselves out of our transit crisis hole and our mobility hole in the city and in the region, we have a tremendous opportunity to reduce inequality. Because imagine, the billions of dollars of investment that are needed in our city and region could go to be distributed a little bit more equally than they have before. So with that, I'll stop, and I apologize that I won't be able to stay through the entire Q&A, but thank you so much for your time.
Great, so now we have
Q&A.
10 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll allow our esteemed panelists to answer them as they see fit. So go ahead.
And
Floor
so
is open.
FYI, we have microphones that are going to go around the room. David, who is standing in the middle, and myself have microphones. We're just going to ask you to wait to get a mic to you.
Thank you very much. There are so many questions, but I just had an idea. You talk about tourists as a big business. Do they pay their fair share in terms of the right to come into the city and use all of our facilities? Secondly, commuters can be considered tourists, and they come into the city and they don't pay their fair share. What about the idea of bringing back the commuter tax? Because back then we had a lot of money from that.
Oh, by the way, the MTA doesn't stand for Metropolitan Transportation Authority. It stands for money thrown away. Okay, a good example would be the Second Avenue Stubway, which is pretty short and sweet. Okay, the current executive director, she didn't run the MTA mainly because she held a public hearing on primary election day, which was a complete disaster. I reminded her people campaign and vote doesn't work the polls.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Yes, you?
Yes, so this question is to Ms. Sanchez. Your excellent presentation. If you're willing to share, be interested to hear your thoughts on the proposed transit agency governance. We heard Professor Paaswell's thoughts. I'd like to hear yours.
So we'll now open it up. So.
Okay, there are 3 questions. I'm not sure what the second one was about the Second Avenue subway, but we know that took a long time, and I always like to point out that my friends in China are building 200 miles of high-speed rail every year. So that's another way of looking at it. But their governance is different. First of all, taxes. I agree. People aren't paying their fair share. I think the fares are set too low. But in terms of equity, I think the transit, the business of the MTA is to provide trips. Trips cost a certain amount of money. What does it cost? Just operating. Look at the operating budget, divide by the number of trips, and you find out what the cost per trip is. That's what people should pay. Because if you're providing milk to schools, the school buys milk from the milk company at what the milk costs. If they want to pay 50 cents on that, they would get half a container of milk. So they're providing trips. However, if the government has a social contract with the people, which it does, if school children are to ride free, the school board should buy down the price of those trips. If we feel it's important for workers, non-skilled workers, perhaps low-income workers, to get to work, especially for onerous commutes, for the people that clean these buildings in central New York but live in the Bronx or live in Queens or live in Staten Island because that's all they can afford, there should be a way of subsidizing their fare. And that's something that's never come up. The idea of the fixed fare started with the idea of the token. It started with the idea when the developers built the elevated lines out to develop new property, just charge people a nickel for the fare, and then they'll buy our houses in the Bronx, which of course have been since displaced by longer things. So we've never gotten over the fact that there should be only one uniform fare for New York, and the only subsidies you get are, if you're my age, you get a senior card, which I feel I'm ripping them off because I use the system 5 or 6 times a day. So if there's any executives here, don't charge me more for my senior card. But we have to look at fares. Why shouldn't a commuter, a tourist, pay the true value of the operating costs? If I go to Paris or London or someplace else, I pay the operating costs. I pay $4 a ride, $5 a ride. That's part of what it costs, and I don't frown, because I'm riding on a great system that's maintained well and is paid for well. So I agree. We have to rethink that, especially the commuters. Second Avenue subway took a long time. All construction in New York takes a long time. Two reasons. One is it costs more to build in New York just because of the difficulties of building in New York, and that's another seminar for another time. And the second is what I said before. If you want to get capital money, you got to go hand in hand to Albany or to Washington every single year. It's not like my friends in LA. I think LA, right today, LA is the best run system outside New York, which is great, is the best run system in the United States. They're LA, of all places, is planning 30, 60, 80, 100 miles of new rail, subway, and light rail line, and they have money in the bank for the next 5 years. That's what you really need to have. And the third question was?
That was on the governance. That was actually
The governance.
Thank you. I forgot what I wanted to tackle first, but in terms of, well, I suppose I'll start with the first question about paying the fair share. So yes, let's revisit the payroll mobility tax, but also let's revisit ways to produce more income for the MTA. Now, there's this one idea called Move New York that has been floating around for a couple of years. Hopefully, it'll gain more traction soon because by pricing the entrance of vehicles for hire vehicles to a lesser extent, but private automobiles into the central business district, you can actually generate a lot of funding for the city for transportation and for the MTA. That has included an equity component into it whereby you would reduce the tolls on the outer parts of the city. So for instance, my father for many years commuted from the Bronx to Long Island for work, and he had to pay, $400 a month between, there was no transit option unless he came into the city and then took the Long Island Railroad and then, took a cab or a bus or something like that and did a 2.5-hour version. But otherwise, there was no transportation option, and yet he still had to pay $300-400 a month in maintenance, gas, tolls, and everything else, right? So reducing those tolls in those other areas where there are no transit options and increasing the cost of being in the city, in the core, in order to raise revenues for the MTA. Third, and this idea of we shouldn't probably have a flat fee for our transit services. With new technologies, I think that the conversation is reinvigorated because, channeling my economics 101 or all of our economics 101 is the idea of price discrimination, right? So you should be able to charge more for those who have a higher ability to pay, and then you should be able to offer discounts to senior citizens, to the low income, to disabled people, to those who have a tougher time with the higher fares, but still provide more money in the end of the day for the transportation services. So then with respect to the governance question, and then I'll have to head out and love y'all, but I have to go. We're exploring a couple of different ideas about how to rethink the operations of the MTA. And NJ Transit and Port Authority, et cetera, et cetera. They have to do with how finance and operations interact and capital projects. They have to do with when public-private partnerships work and when they do not. They're not a cure-all, but there are certain characteristics that make certain 3Ps very successful, and how can we elevate those and in some ways institutionalize those. So again, without giving away the cake for November 30th, it's something that we're thinking a lot about, and it's a very important question. Thank you.
I just want to add one more thing about fares. You want to make fares. The lower the income, the higher the fare is a part of your income, and you want to get a balance between that. And something I've been saying for the last 20 years, you want to solve some of that problem. One is build more affordable housing closer to where people work to make the commute less onerous. And second, pay a living wage, and people will be able to afford that more.
Additional questions? Yep. Sorry, the one in the back here. Yep.
Let's start here because I'm here.
Start here, then here, and then we'll get you.
Well, I had a question for Ms. Sanchez, but you can also answer it. I was just wondering how important, like it's always interesting to come to these kinds of forums where you hear people who are studying these issues talk very rationally about what needs to be done. But then when you look at what happens, it just doesn't seem like there's any real planning or needs assessment in terms of mass transit. And I guess my question is, you know, is there any real kind of statutory requirement that, for example, the Port Authority do a needs assessment? They just renovated the George Washington Bridge bus station, and it was all about putting glass in the bus station and nothing for mass transit. So, like, the idea of getting across the Hudson, that didn't even factor into the conversation. And literally, it's like, can we get a Marshalls here? And when they were asked at the community board about, you know, their population, whether they did any kind of needs assessment with respect to mass transit, and this was like 7 years ago, they said, we don't expect any growth in population up here, and we don't see any reason to think that there'll be an increase in need. And so I feel like, you know, you guys are you know what the solutions are, but it's almost like in a vacuum. I don't know if that's governance or whatever, but what do you think?
Take two more questions up front and then all the way in the back.
Hi, thank you. I want to commend both speakers for very excellent presentations. Professor Paswell, maybe you could comment on this. Now in 2017, there's a new dynamic creating pressure for both operating and capital funds, and that is that we have an administration in Washington that is overtly hostile to cities and transit and everything else we hold dear in New York, despite the fact that its leader is a Manhattan resident, at least allegedly. So this is going to create more issues for both the operating needs and the future big capital needs.
Yeah, my question is, why does the transit system have to always be so Manhattan-centric? Those of us who live out in Long Island City, we actually like the idea of the Brooklyn-Queens connector, keeping people in their neighborhoods, working in their communities, and therefore the transit system doesn't be overtaxed. And also they need some leadership on the issue regarding how, in fact, trains, in fact, run. Just very simply, why does the A train have to go all the way to Rockaway all the time? Can it stop at, you know, West 4th Street or J Street, Borough, and that's it? You can cut down on services, cut down on time. A train doesn't have to run to Rockaway Park all the time.
So there's only two of us now, but needs assessment, the man who shall not be named in the Oval Office, and the outer people who live out there like me.
Let me talk about the governance issue. The Port Authority, obviously, Port Authority does planning and capital planning, and the revitalization of the Nervi terminal up at 168th Street was long overdue, and it was part of looking at the whole bus services around the region. Obviously, they should look at the pass system at the same time. Talk to the Port Authority about that. This is the MTA thing. But let me say that with a smile on my face, because in a sense, a region is supposed to do regional planning among transportation agencies. It's required by law. We have an organization, a metropolitan planning organization, New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, that's supposed to be the clearinghouse for all this. But it's got a lot of what they call 800-pound giants who sort of get in the way of that. New York State DOT, the MTA, et cetera, and the Port Authority. And they all do their own planning. And they all do it independently of each other. They don't agree on population forecasts, which is where you start with any planning. They don't agree on where employment is going to be or what form. If I were to ask the Port Authority, who are going to be the big employers in 2030, and New York State DOT and the MTA, I would probably get different things. Are they going to be medical services, financial services, tourism, et cetera, and where are they going to be? So the problem is you have a number of very strong, very powerful, large, tens of thousands of employees, billions of dollar budget organizations who are each competing with each other to be on the table for their projects without any clearinghouse or projects. We've written about that for the last 15 years. There's papers. You go to the UTRC2 website, and this is on the UTRC2 website, and you can look at a number of papers that we've talked about that deal with that. and it's very hard to get around that. And a lot of it has to do with how the state is organized, and the irony, of course, is the Port Authority and the MTA are state public authorities, and New York State DOT, part of federal law since 1916. They're all heavy players, and they're all going to be around for a long time, and they don't all come to the table and agree on what's what. So that's a big issue. The administration in D.C., we went for almost a whole morning without talking about that, you know? You wake up every day and you say, oh, it's not a dream. So I can't answer that, you know. But they're dealing with Mar-a-Lago at the same time they're dealing with New York, so maybe that's part of the issue. Manhattan-centric. Read the history of the growth of the 5 boroughs, and it started at the tip of Manhattan. And the subways, when they were built, they were first built as L lines and then eventually as subways, all went to serve Manhattan. And then the big rush and why we have trains up 6th Avenue, there were trolleys on every avenue, and then eventually elevated trains. And then they discovered, oh, there's farmland in the Bronx. And look at a picture of Washington Heights in 1920, and you'll see it's farms. And then they brought trains up there. So everything was developed to bring people to the center of Manhattan. It's a huge investment in rail infrastructure that you can't throw away. And so, as we know, investment in transportation creates access, access creates value, and people want to be where the value is. That's a fact of life. If you want to change it, you have to change the nature of investment and accessibility to the areas that you want to serve.